Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
After Christopher Columbus founded Cuba in 1492, Cuba was soon invaded by the Spaniards. The Aboriginal groups living on the island were soon eliminated because of diseases and shock of conquest. Cuba's business class, the Creoles, promoted a sugar revolution, and Cuba became a major sugar producer in the world. Cuban loyalty began to change toward the end of the 19th century as a result of Creole rivalry with the Spaniards. The argument turned into a 10-year war against Spain, lasting from 1868 to 1878, but Cuba still failed to win its independence. In the 1930s, there was a major attempt at revolution, which was promoted by the cruel dictatorship of Gerardo Machado y Morales. This was because of the economic hardships of the World Depression and the growing control of their economy by the Spaniards and the North Americans.
During Batista's presidency and dictatorship, the military emerged as the sole power of Cuba's politics and government. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a large rise in communism. Cuba was ruled by the dictator General Batista. Batista allowed American companies and organized crime to exploit the Cubans.
On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro Ruz, an anti-U.S. revolutionary, seized power following his successful revolt against the U.S.-backed Batista government.
Led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, the Cuban people revolted and overthrew Batista. Castro became the new leader of Cuba, and his revolution promised to treat all Cubans equally. Faced with an aggressive U.S. government, Castro turned to the USSR for aid and support. Cuba soon adopted a communist government and became a close ally of the USSR.
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents had been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba. This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
In 1960, the CIA began to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles.
The exiles invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, but were easily defeated by Castro's army. Many were captured or killed, and the USA did nothing to help.
In June of 1961, Khrushchev and Kennedy met at a summit between the East and West to discuss the Cold War. The two leaders failed to resolve their differences, and it led Khrushchev to believe that Kennedy was a weak leader who lacked the ability to negotiate in an arms race. Fueled by concerns that the U.S. had more nuclear missiles than the Soviet arsenal and that some of the American missiles were based miles from its borders, the Soviet leadership grew increasingly desperate to somehow tip the balance of power in its favor. On October 22, 1962, after reviewing new intelligence, President John F. Kennedy informed the world that the Soviet Union was building secret missile bases in Cuba, only 90 miles off the shores of Florida. Castro soon became convinced that the U.S. was serious about invading Cuba. Sensing an opportunity to gain a strategic hold in America's backyard, Khrushchev extended assistance to the Cuban general. Khrushchev offered Castro new trade opportunities and a promise of protection from the U.S. The alliance between Castro and Khrushchev was the groundwork for what ended up being the Soviet missile base in Cuba and which ended in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev began building missile bases in Cuba. After debating options like an armed invasion of Cuba and airstrikes against the missiles, Kennedy decided on a less dangerous approach. He demanded that Khrushchev remove all the missile bases and their deadly weapons from the island. Kennedy also ordered a naval blockade of Cuba in order to prevent Russian ships from bringing additional construction materials to the island. Khrushchev authorized his Soviet field commanders in Cuba to launch their nuclear weapons if invaded by U.S. forces. The two leaders of the world's greatest nuclear superpowers were in deadlock for 7 days. On October 28th, Khrushchev gave in to President Kennedy's demands by ordering all Soviet supply ships away from Cuban waters and the removal of all the missiles from Cuban mainlands.
The rest of the world watched in fear. This had set the USA and the USSR, the world's superpowers, directly against each other. The world now feared nuclear war, but luckily the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. agreement to not invade Cuba.
The Cuban Missile Crisis largely affected both the people of Cuba and the rest of the world. Cuba didn't want to be involved in the Cold War, and Castro greatly objected to his country's sudden involvement in it. After the crisis was resolved, Cuba was completely dependent on the support of the USSR. In exchange, Castro had to back the communist revolutions happening in Latin America and Africa. This sole dependence on the Soviet Union turned out to be terrible. Support for the USSR abruptly stopped upon their breakup in 1991. Cuba's economy fell apart and Castro had to loosen the control of his economy and seek better relations with foreign countries.